I mean, you raise $75 billion. There's only a handful of companies out there that can compete with you.
Yeah, and the funny thing is that his closest competitors, at least in the AI space, were also recruited by him, right? So like if you think about the one person in the world who can recruit the best, most technical talent, he's the person that brought together the OpenAI team.
Once it's in there, if you're solely dependent upon one supplier, Anthropic or OpenAI, you see how sticky it is to rip out these technologies. Once people get hooked on them, it's like a drug. So the fallout from SpaceX had the IPO. There's a lot of hype. There's a lot of momentum. I think at one point it was up 56% from the IPO. I don't know. I think it was down for the last 2 days, given our focus on the public markets and especially technology companies. I'd love to get your assessment on the state of SpaceX now that we are post-IPO and now they're getting the scrutiny of the public markets.
Well, the pop was pretty predictable. There was obviously a lot more demand than there was float on the market. Only about 4% of the
shares are actually available to be traded. So naturally, there's a supply and demand mismatch. When companies that are already heavily valued go up 60% extra, there'll be additional people that take money off the table, but most of the shares are still locked. And with the financial engineering involved, with the index funds changing their rules, the index providers changing their rules to allow SpaceX in a lot sooner, which is coming up in, I believe it's 15 days post-IPO with the NASDAQ 100, and actually sooner for the FTSE index and a couple of the others.
Could you dive in more to that, why that's so important, and what's the standard? And then why is this so relevant and important that SpaceX did this?
Yeah, so before SpaceX, it was pretty normal for most of these index providers to have a whole 1 year period in order to be eligible. Not only did you need to have a 1 year of liquidity, you needed to have a certain amount of your float that was a lot higher than 4% be on the market. And typically you also had a profitability requirement as well. And these rules were put in place to prevent what happened in the dot-com boom, where there were a lot of companies that were included in the indexes that dragged them down because they were pets.com, they just got in quickly because of their valuation, and then investors suffered. Well, SpaceX convinced several of these indices to change the rules for them. Notably, the S&P 500 did not change the rules, but the NASDAQ did. So, there's some financial engineering involved. SpaceX is obviously taking advantage of the pop. So what they did is they immediately exercised an option to buy Cursor for $60 billion of stock, and that stock gets to be valued at a volume weighted price for some of these higher weighted days. I believe it's like 10 days of going public or something like that. And they're also taking advantage by issuing what's rumored is a $20 billion debt package is on the way, which kind of was, the trigger for this recent pullback. Like the last one trading day pullback is this debt package. So it's pretty clear all of this was put in place to take advantage of the financial conditions. And some people are even saying that SpaceX might try to acquire Tesla at these elevated prices. I think that's all speculation, and who knows what's going to happen. It wouldn't surprise me either way. But it's certainly an exciting company, and they are using their stock as a currency. And, it's very smart of them. At Plutus 21, we're not investing in SpaceX stock at 100 or 150 or 200 times revenue or any of that. But we are watching, and learning from what they're doing. And I think that, patient investors will have an opportunity at some point down the line to get in at a more reasonable valuation. That would be my bet.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that, and I want to get your thoughts on this, Hamez, where the acquisition of Cursor, what that showed was that was the first of all of the AI investment that we've seen, build out on the infrastructure, everybody chasing, now what it seems is everybody trying to chase the application layer of AI. This was the first really large scale acquisition to take place from the AI application layer. Love to just
it's actually, if you put it in context, it's actually the largest M&A transaction from a venture capital stage company. It's like nothing's ever gotten close to a $60 billion transaction. So it is by any measure a really incredible outcome for the investors within Cursor and obviously the team members as well. The other, not surprising, but pretty amazing thing is all the founders are very young. The founders are in their 20s, and they all were students at MIT when they dropped out and started to build the business. And their individual net worths are somewhere in the $3 to $4 billion now each, as 20-year-olds. So it's a pretty incredible outcome, I think, for many of them. But I think the reason that Cursor in particular is more interesting than some of the other acquisitions that we've seen is because it's one of the few companies that when you look at the layers of any of these technologies, which will be the infrastructure, the platform, and the application, Cursor is interesting because they sat at the platform and the application layer, but with the acquisition and with the integration with SpaceX, they actually now fit all three of the buckets in some way or fashion. So it's a really well integrated and vertically integrated business now, because if you look across the application layers today, or even some of the platform companies, many of them, in order to get the growth rates that they're getting, they're subsidizing a lot of the people at the application layer. So, it might cost them $50 to service a customer, but they're selling that subscription for $20 to the customer just to get that growth. And that was continuing to become a bigger and bigger problem unless you started to vertically integrate into the platform and the infrastructure. Unless you started to own the data centers, unless you started to own the model companies and you started to vertically integrate it, then you have an inherent advantage. Where a company like Google that sits actually in all three of these verticals can use excess capacity at the infrastructure layer, can the same capacity as some of their competitors would have to pay for, right? And so in this very heavily subsidized stage of the cycle, it really pays to be vertically integrated, and it gives you this inherent advantage over your competition. And so if Cursor was simply a platform company, it wouldn't be so interesting. If it was just an application company, they would struggle with the unit economics. But because of this combination with SpaceX, they're actually able to be a much more vertically integrated business, and actually has a real, I think, interesting business model underneath now, which was not possible as an independent business.
Yeah, I think we'll look back on this acquisition. We've previously talked about the value of Cursor. I think we'll look back on this acquisition by, SpaceX or the subsidiary xAI as quite a discount. If you think about it, is they got Cursor for $60 billion. From what I'm seeing is the tea leaves indicate that they're pointing towards, they're starting to use this term useful AI. And so they've also been working with, rumor mill has it, they've been already working with xAI and building a model. So I think the market that they're going to go after is the Claude Code Codex market. And now there's going to be a third player in the market. And so if OpenAI, Anthropic are going to go to public for 800 million or 800 billion to $1 trillion, I think we'll look back and be like, what was $60 billion? And now xAI gets to be a real player in the everyday AI use. And then ultimately, they will create more competition and force these companies to continue to subsidize their models, because a $200 max subscription is subsidized up to $8,000. and a $200 a month Kodak subscription is up to $14,000. And so eventually what's going to happen is public markets are going to scrutinize them, and then they're going to pass along those costs to the consumers. And that's why you see this mad rush to get these consultants to implement these technologies inside these companies, because once it's in there, if you're solely dependent upon one supplier, Anthropic or OpenAI, you see how sticky it is to rip out these technologies. Once people get hooked on them, it's like a drug. And so I think that's where this is going, and ultimately having a third player and historically betting on Elon Musk has been a good thing. And I think the $60 billion is like just a drop in the bucket on the outcome, but it only makes sense when you combine it with like somebody that has the capabilities of like an XAI that can then go build useful everyday AI to compete with Claude Code.
Yeah, and I think Elon Musk realized that the premier, application for AI that can be sold to the market is coding services, right? That's what people are going to spend actual money on tokens. By having their own chips, as well as their partnerships, they have already, but their own chip designs, their own production, they've already created a cost advantage on the supply side. So they can create an equivalently good model as OpenAI or Anthropic for a lower cost. They have the ability to put up these massive data centers that Anthropic and OpenAI don't have. And that's just an Elon Musk, somehow making things go faster than anyone else, right? But Jensen Huang from NVIDIA was saying that he couldn't believe how fast.
They're doing it faster and cheaper than anybody else. Like they're able to stamp out apparently data centers in like 90-day periods.
Like insane stuff that would normally be like a year plus for everyone else.
And usually you expect when you're doing things, everybody else is doing it in 12 months, you're doing it in 3 to 6 months, it will cost you more, actually cost them less. So they've really kind of refined the very early on, because they had to build these models and train them internally. They've really refined the process of stamping out data centers, and I think the big kind of gap or the big constraint in the market is access to the chips, access to the electricity and things like that. And if there is one person in the world that nobody really could reject a phone call from, it's probably Elon, right? Like none of the chip manufacturers would reject a phone call from him. None of the politicians necessarily, I don't think, would reject a phone call from him either. So that really does play to their advantage. And his experience in stamping out, gigafactories and stamping out production lines, like it all helps. Because if you think about today, if there's somebody alive who has the most experience building physical infrastructure from scratch in like highly technical industries, it's probably Elon. From anybody in the world, he probably has the most experience doing it in the most industries and in the most countries, and you can't pay enough money for that type of experience. And I think it might not be that he's that good at stamping out these data centers, but when you have a leader like that, it attracts the absolute best talent out there to come work for him, where they might not feel the same way about an Oracle or or something like that, but they feel like that with Elon, just given the aura.
Elon Musk, his more recent ventures with SpaceX and Tesla are more hardware heavy, and so people think of him as the hardware guy. But he's actually well-rounded. His initial base of wealth came from the software side, from selling PayPal. So he has both the software and the hardware chops and knows how to motivate and recruit the right talent and get it done. And he basically has what's feeling like unlimited amounts of capital. I mean, you raise $75 billion, there's only a handful of companies out there that can compete with you. And OpenAI and Anthropic don't have anywhere near that much capital. They'll obviously go public and try to raise capital as well, but I think it's going to be less than that amount.
Yeah, and the funny thing is that his closest competitors, at least in the AI space, were also recruited by him, right? So like if you think about the one person in the world who can recruit the best, most technical talent, he's the person that brought together the OpenAI team. And the Anthropic team broke off of the OpenAI team, right? So like if let's say there's 3 or 4 like big players in the market in the AI space, he's kind of the recruiter for all of them. And so like the ability to inspire the best talent in the world to come work for a mission like that is the softest, but actually the most important advantage when one of these technologies shift, because everybody else is always a step behind you, given that you're able to, inspire people to leave YC and start an AI company, right? Like it's just, you're able to pull talent from anywhere in the world.
Yeah, Elon's resume definitely speaks for itself. So while we're on the topic of OpenAI, Anthropic going public, and we're talking about different models, I think now's a good time to pivot towards the state of CapEx spend inside of companies. So this week, GLM, an open source model, dropped, and what it looked like, it was the first open source model that could actually compete with an Opus or a GPT 5.5 from a reasoning standpoint. So now if you look at the broader market, a few months ago, token maxing was in, and Anthropic and Jensen Huang, and everybody was like, we need all of our engineers to spend $250,000, like throwing all regard for spend out the window. And now the Uber CEO said we're cutting back, and a lot of these companies are realizing that, hey, maybe we shouldn't token max.
Maybe we should value max.
Value max now, yes. But the problem is the models were not, you couldn't tap into an open source and get the same or close to productivity as what you could for some of these frontier models. Well,
so to talk a little bit on that thread is, if you look actually at the open source models, even over the last year or so, the performance on a model-to-model basis has already closed. This one particular model might be surpassing it, but the gap has already closed over the years. The reason that it still felt much more powerful to be using a Anthropic in Cloud Code or a Cursor model was all of what was built on top of the core model. That's what made the harness and the engineering around the experience is what made that experience feel better. And so I think for many months now, companies have been able to get better results when they have built the harness and the infrastructure around the model for their specific use case. But now you have that plus the underlying model also getting better than the closed source version. So now you're taking a step function in the right direction. But from a capability perspective, the capabilities had already closed 6 months ago if you were implementing the model into the right infrastructure.
Yeah, harness matters, but if you really needed horsepower to get tasks done, you would still depend on those models because of their deep reasoning, because of the way that they were constructed. Open source was not quite there yet. This model was the first one that could compete on a benchmark and performance level along with those frontier models. So yeah, I think, but to your point, where they were closing the gap, I think more specifically, was I think we're going to get into this phase where for open source, it's good. It gets the job done for what you need done. I think we've become so accustomed to just wanting the best, where reality is like, you don't need the best for every single task. Like if your harness is sophisticated and you're like, hey, go fetch me, my call list for the day from Salesforce, like you don't need Opus 4.8 to go do that. You could probably use an open source model because it can carry out a task like that. And I think we're going to start seeing this shift where it's more common usage because these open source models can get it done. And then ultimately, now you don't have to worry about CapEx. So like, if you were to follow Accenture in the public markets, it sold off 20% this week. and it cited that IT spending is down. So I think what the result is like AI spend and token spend is now a key part of how you're running these organizations. So there's not extra capital to then go do a lot of more R&D. So I think a return to somewhat normalcy and is how do I shrink my token budget to where it's actually sustainable and I could still get the productivity output that I need, but at a cost that still makes sense. And I think with this latest breakthrough with GLM, early results are showing like, yeah, this is a model that can keep up and will probably be at like a Fable level by the end of the year.
Yeah, I think just to put some, for the audience, if they don't know the specifics of each of these models you're talking about, what I've seen on the benchmarks, when you look at the performance versus the token cost, right now we're just getting to the point where some of these latest, whether it's the latest open source models or the latest XAI model, they're now achieving something like 90 to 95% of the performance at 20% of the cost for tokens. And that performance is good enough to do most of the tasks. And I think for maybe only the most important tasks, maybe you try it with the cheaper option first, and then if it doesn't work, you can reroute it to the more expensive option. And there's going to be more and more of this like cost optimization, routing technology that's put in place at all of these organizations. You just have to. It makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, Ben, you spend a lot of time playing around with Claude and all the different configurations within it. What do you think makes it special? Like, what kind of workflows and how much more can you get out of it if you really specialize in the Claude kind of ecosystem?
Yeah, I think Claude as a harness is the best kind of one that people use publicly. And so Claude Design came out a few months ago. That's an example of, I think, what Anthropic's doing really well in making user interface really attractive for using their models. If ChatGPT came out and their GPT 5.5 had that same structure around it, I think it would provide a relatively similar experience. So people are choosing to use Claude because of the harness. So I think with regards to open source, I think if it gets to a point where those models are comparable to a 4.8 or a 5.5 from OpenAI, and you just have that harness around it be user-friendly, and for a business, if it was business-specific, then it would be extremely usable and far more cost-efficient. So it really is, I think, about the infrastructure.
Yeah. And then when you kind of go deeper into that harness, what are, how much more can you get out of that ecosystem? Or is it better, do you think, for people to work across ecosystems, like work in open source, add that to their Claude, workflow, and then kind of route different tasks to different places? Or do you think it pays to be more specialized in an ecosystem?
Well, it's pretty inefficient to, I think, go across systems. I don't think it'd be like that forever. I think that's pretty, for people like us who use AI a lot, I think it makes sense because it's kind of like a, kind of you're crafting together the solution, but it really should be one thing you're using. I think we'll see that in the future. I think these tools will become usable and we'll kind of get better at figuring out what models are good for what. And then new models will also come out that maybe we won't have to worry about kind of crafting together these things at all.
Yeah, I think from a usability standpoint, OpenAI and Anthropic have cornered the market there.
Yes.
Where no random person on the street who's like, oh yeah, I use Claude to, no one's going to be like, oh, I use GLM to model out my, because it's not user friendly. Now for the engineers that are racking up token costs and really spending a lot, I think this is a big breakthrough because they would know, they should know how to deploy it in an open source into your local environment and then code with it. But from a usability standpoint, I think overall what this is, I don't think consumers have a lot of loyalty one way or another. They're going to drift if Cursor and XAI hit it and they're the best on the market. I think people just start drifting to that. And I think that's going to be the underlying problem with a lot of these companies is I don't think there's a lot of loyalty between these. And
yeah, what you're basically saying is there's just a lot of commoditization.
And there's definitely not loyalty. So if you take go take a step back from the professional use case and just go to the retail use case, you can actually see it in the market share stats that in the last, just this year, the last few months, Gemini is taking a lot of market share and ChatGPT has been losing market share. That's for your most basic use of AI. But people will switch very easily, especially if they are using one program and it's saying you're out of tokens or your time's out. I've switched, to using Gemini more because of this reason. So at some point you get to where the output is good enough and it's just who's actually fastest, right? It's no longer who's the best answer, who's giving you the fastest answer and not, rate limiting you.
Yeah, but I think the money though gets made in the business use case, right? I don't think any of the, I don't think the big addressable markets here are individual subscriptions to people. Businesses might not be loyal, but businesses can get implementations that are really sticky, where the model is implemented in a very customized way, exactly how the business needs it. And that really kills the incentive to switch all these different ecosystems. Because it just, like, all a harness is a specialized implementation for a specialized workflow. That's all it is. Cursor has a harness, Claude has a harness. Like, they're just specializing that core model, which, the Cursor uses Anthropic models too. But they give very different answers in a coding environment than when you talk to Claude, and that's more of a conversational environment, right? So the underlying model is the most commoditized part of this. Yes. What makes the experience special is that you have really implemented a very custom version for a custom workflow. And that is what will happen in businesses. And that will make it hard for businesses to switch. And that's why I think OpenAI and Anthropic are investing in these forward deployed engineers, is because they realize that what makes Salesforce sticky is not that Salesforce is the best CRM. It's because there has been hundreds of millions of dollars spent every year implementing Salesforce in organizations. And once it's implemented, there's really a lot of cost to switch to another provider, no matter how much better or even cheaper the other provider might be. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And back to that point on retail usage, the winner, it will definitely be, I think if we assume that LLMs or model costs will kind of be commoditized, and it won't really matter what model you use, as long as it's relatively well known or something, then the winner of, I think, the retail use will be almost like the Apple of an AI, where it's just it's it's attractive for a human to use it. It focuses on the consumer experience as much as possible. I think Perplexity actually does a really good job at this. And so kind of if you project out and say it doesn't matter what model you're using, then the best, kind of the winner of the consumer market will definitely be whoever focuses the most on just kind of human experience.
So do you think it's good that companies narrow in on one, or do you think that they should depend on multiple LLMs, including open source?
Yeah, I think that I would be pretty wary of zeroing in on a single provider if it's closed source. If it's their infrastructure, their model, their control, I'd be pretty wary of that, because there's serious platform risk there. But if I had a family of models that I had deployed on my infrastructure, and it was open source, and I understood how the pricing worked, because I was paying for the infrastructure, not the tokens, then I would have no problem really depending on one of them. But yeah, I wouldn't, and I think most executives are like this. I think most executives don't want the platform risk of Anthropic or OpenAI or Gemini or any of them. If they had the choice, historically they haven't really had the choice, right? You had to pick between Microsoft or Google, and you didn't really have a third option. And then once you went inside the ecosystem, they could really do what they wanted with you, but generally they did fine with companies, so they've been around. But if there was an open source version of, let's say, the Microsoft suite that was just as good, I think there'd be a lot more people more comfortable with that structure. And that is possible here. Yeah. So I would have no problem hitching my ride to a single family of models if it was our infrastructure, our cost control, our data sovereignty. I would have no problem with that.
I think corporations actually need to maintain flexibility, just because with the pace of new models and the decline in token costs, if you're an executive, you might make a decision today that's with all the information you have today, but it could be a totally different decision in 3 months or in 6 months. And so they are always going to maintain flexibility, and I think at least so if you lock in, it's a relatively short period of time, because that's just the pace that this technology is advancing, and you need to keep that flexibility.
Yeah, and what this past weekend showed was now the government. Now we're getting to a point with these models to where they can be ruled as national security risk. So with that being said, you have to, if you're running a business, you cannot be dependent upon one platform, because say they do release the latest model, if the government views it as a national security risk and pulls it, then your business now your business ceases, comes to a halt. So which you can't have. So you absolutely have to be running a switchboard of different LLMs inside, including open source, one that's in your local environment that nobody can rip out. And everybody gets over when AWS or Azure goes down, everybody forgives that. So no one's going to get upset if that happens. But you have complete control over that. But if the government decides that Fable is now a national security risk because it's been exploited in some way, then okay, your business is now at risk out of something that you just did not plan properly for. And so I think that it's not a guarantee anymore either that the public gets access to the most frontier model. And if I had to predict, I actually think that's how these model companies actually make money, is they will get in so deep with the government, they give them access to the latest and greatest models, and the government continues to subsidize that business.
Yeah, did you see, I think there was some proposal for a bill from Bernie Sanders. Did you see that? Where he wants to force all AI companies to sell 50% of their stock to the people, basically the U.S. government, and then the U.S. government puts together a panel. I think it was 7 or 10 people, and they get to vote those 50% of the stock, so that they can make the decisions that are best for the people, not necessarily the shareholders. But it's an interesting concept, right? The concept is, this technology is important to national security. This technology is important to the future of humanity. And so we shouldn't have a small group of people that are not thinking about the broader population make decisions. We should have 50% of it owned by investors, but the other 50% of it owned by a public board of people. Yeah. It's an interesting concept.
I do not want to nationalize.
No, but why not?
Well, even Trump is actually saying something in a watered down version, but Trump and Howard Lutnick are talking about how can the United States take stakes, not 50% stakes, but take smaller stakes in each of these companies into some kind of U.S. version of a sovereign wealth fund.
Smaller stakes, I think, is important. Smaller stakes, I would be fine with.
No, but you're a minority shareholder. The U.S. government has a 9 or 10% stake in Intel, right? He can't do anything with that. If Intel decides to sell, it decides to make decisions that are against the American people, that 9% or 10% won't make any difference.
Still, if we get into if we let our government now into the fold, things will slow down. You are now dealing with a different subset of people.
I agree.
Right?
We'll start losing.
Yeah.
Somewhere else in the world will make an open source model and move faster, or a closed source model and move faster.
Why is Europe so far behind us right now when it comes to this? It is because the only thing that they can export is regulation. They move so slow that even the largest companies in the world can't move at the pace that they need to of innovation, and they are going to fall behind because they're just regulate this, regulate that. They try to put a stranglehold and they slow down the rate of innovation. And yes, like I would rather there be a healthy mix of like capital markets are pushing innovation forward, and then, okay, we're trying to reel this in as we go. It won't be perfect, but eventually the rate of innovation still continues to progress. And as soon as you bring politicians, we all know the government moves slower than the public markets. And honestly, like, do we trust that our government is fully aligned with the way of what the people want? Like, no, nobody here is 100% aligned with the politician that they vote for. So to think that all of a sudden these guys who spent their entire lifetime being career politicians.
What if this board of people is actually from the people? Like there's 7 or 10 people or regular people.
Like a jury?
Yeah, like kind of like a jury.
Once you get non-economic stakeholders in the business of running companies, they inevitably slow down. I mean, there's hundreds of years of socialist experiments that all end the same way. You're just not going to outcompete free market capitalism with some bureaucratic, government board. No, it's never happened. If it's ever happened, I'd love an example. I can give 1,000
No, I'm not
examples
for
of that.
socialism. I'm just trying to strawman the argument and try to get a real answer out of it. But this is not a regular business. It just
Yeah, if the U.S. Slows down all of the American companies working on AI, China's going to outcompete us. They have all the
they're not
capital and
winning,
incentive
but
to.
China-
It's a nationals.
I know
priority.
exactly. China is not winning because it's some pure capitalist economy. They're winning because it's very organized from the top down, and they're making the push. Why shouldn't we make the same push from the top down? Have it be more organized.
Their companies are operating in a very capitalistic, independent way. And they're competing with each other the same way the American companies are. Alibaba is making one model, ByteDance is doing another model. They have Tencent's doing a different model. They have the same type of competition. And by the way, they're distilling the American models, and the Americans are distilling the Chinese models. They feed off of each other. So if you slow down any of them, they're going to be at a disadvantage. It's not like the Communist Party of China has a board saying, let's compete with the Americans. That's not what's happening. They have their own large companies
that's
competing.
not what's happening.
That's not what's happening.
That's not so. There's no broader agenda from the Chinese government.
It's a national.
to push
It's a national security. It's a national thing of importance to clear the way, the same way it is in America. That's why you also have in America, you have an AI czar, and you have this as a priority, but they're not going into the companies and saying you can do this and you can't do this and we have to get our approval to do this and that.
That's what's happening in China.
You can see
There is
it.
no instruction from the Chinese government on how these Chinese model companies are running. There's no instruction at all.
I think it's fair to
They're
say.
actually getting out of the way, is what you're saying.
What I'm saying is that, obviously I'm not in these companies. I don't live in China. I'm not seeing it. All I can do is look at the outputs. The outputs of the Chinese models are at a similar pace of innovation as the American models.
Okay.
They might have less capital. They might have a little bit less access to the latest and greatest chips. They might have to find different ways of innovating, but they have a whole ecosystem of individual companies competing against each other the same way that the Americans do. And they are doing their absolute best at the highest level to figure out how do they get those NVIDIA chips, through some other company, or how do they figure out how to produce homegrown chips if they can't get access to the, suppliers.
So they are able to move just as fast as the American
moving very
companies are,
fast.
with all the national security and
Yeah, and you
direction
can see
from
it in the
government.
benchmarks. You can see it in the benchmarks.
Yeah, so you're making my point. Is even with all the national planning
Yeah,
and,
my
and
point-
direction, they're still able to move just as
my
fast.
point is that government.
But there is no, you can't possibly convince me that if there was a model that a Chinese company created that the Chinese government deemed as against their national interest, that they would just be open free competition.
What I will say is this, to the best of my
That will never
knowledge,
happen.
to the best of my knowledge, so far the Chinese have not told a company, you cannot release that model to the
Okay.
public. It is a
Okay.
national security issue. So far that has not happened to my
Okay, so,
knowledge.
and we have.
And we have. So we are at risk of and what if we start doing that across the board? Now we're really at risk of slowing down.
How do you How can you verify that though?
Yeah.
That's the thing is,
Obviously, I can't.
yeah, we can't. So I don't want to recklessly speculate because
But it would
whether
be
we like it or
nice.
not, there is extreme government oversight and involvement in Chinese companies, and they can lie to the U.S. and it's totally fine. So to say that the government hasn't had any sort of involvement, we are not here to fairly speculate, but I don't think you can confirm one way or another. I think it's more likely that the government has, very involved. So at least, again, I don't want to, democratic societies do serve a purpose, but when you're trying to build products, man, you need CEOs, you need vision, you need go, go, go. If you start bringing in more people, more audiences, people who are unqualified to speak on this, and they buy into fear-based narratives, and they think that like all this stuff that really never comes to fruition, if they think it is and it slows down the rate of innovation, you're just asking for trouble. You're going to slow down. It's going to hurt the markets. It's going to hurt all of the investment that we're putting in, and it's going to kill the progress that we're making of these companies, and it opens the door for somebody to step in and take away from the momentum that the USA is building. So if we're going to be the leaders in AI, we cannot just let, Susie from New Hampshire on the board of Anthropic to provide her input about how she's feeling about Claude Code this week. Like, with all respect to Susie in New Hampshire, like, she's not Dario and she's not Sam, right? So,
Talent, I think part of the bottleneck is not just the capital, but it's also the talent, right? If you're an extremely talented person that can go work at any AI company, whether it's in America or China or somewhere else. And by the way, if you look at who's working at these American AI companies, a lot of the people are Chinese. Just putting that out there.
Oh, totally. They're attractive.
They are going to flow like water. Talent flows like water. If they're capped and they can't do something and they can go somewhere else and actually make an impact, they will.
Well, the last few weeks, it's been OpenAI and Anthropic that have swept up the best engineers. I literally think Ilya moved to Anthropic just so he could get access to the latest model. And if Elon's like, I have a better model, I'm sure Ilya will drift back. Google paid like $2 billion to the guy that made the Transformer, and a year and a half later, he's jumping ship now. Like, that all happened just this week. So you're right. I do think that it's just going to drift. But as long as the top talent remains in America and inside these American companies that are innovating, we just have to keep that edge over the competition.